when does a new decade start? 2020 is about to begin and people are arguing over whether the new decade starts then or in 2021. Yes, people are arguing about that. Now, the answer to this question depends on how you define the and what you mean by a decade. But first of all, a decade is just an arbitrary period of 10 years. Decades start and end every day. What we're talking about here is the calendar decade, and that's where things get tricky. Intuition tells us that the new decade starts with the year that ends in 0, because every measurement starts with 0. Well, every measurement except a calendar invented by two monks, one of whom couldn't count. One of them, Dionysius Exiguus, invented the AD era about 1500 years ago. A couple of centuries later, the other one, the Venerable Bede, added the BC era. But when he did that, he neglected to add anything between 1 BC and 1 AD because he couldn't count. Pretty sure days didn't start at 1 o'clock then, nor were babies born at a year old. So why didn't somebody call him on it back then? If at 11:59 PM and 59 seconds in the year 729, the Venerable Bede had said, "Happy New Year, it's 731," somebody might have said, Bede, mate, you've skipped a year. Yeah, it's 730, yeah? 731's next year, mate. But because he was retroactively imposing a calendar on events from 700 years in the past, no one noticed or cared. So now, 1300 years later, you've got people saying, well, because the first decade of the modern calendar started with a 1, every subsequent one does too. To which I say, no, mate, no. Clearly it was a mistake. Numbers start with 0. Bede should have added a 0. He didn't. So ignore it. If that makes you uncomfortable, just add your own 0. If you read about something that happened in 1 BC, just know in your heart that it actually happened in 0 AD. And that will never happen because nobody knows when anything took place back then, partly because you got monks that can't count in charge of the calendar. So why should you ignore it? Because to do otherwise is ludicrous. To do otherwise is to argue that years beginning with 0 belong to the preceding decade. To do otherwise is to say, remember the 1970s when the US boycotted the 1980 Moscow Olympics in the 1970s? Do you really want to be that person? Decades are arbitrary. Decades are cultural. These days we think of decades as the 80s, the 90s, the teens, and now the 20s. Are you really prepared to argue that 2020 is not part of the 20s? It says it right there in the name. Look, if this is the hill you want to die on, then as long as you say, well, the 203rd decade of the Dionysian calendar actually starts in 2021, then I'll say, you know what? You're right. And I'll add, isn't it weird the Venerable Bede couldn't count and yet they let him be in charge of a calendar? But if you say that the 20s don't actually start till 2021, then it will take all of my restraint just to peer at you over my glasses and not be really embarrassed for you that you thought that was a smart thing to say. This has been a rant from Chaise Longue. Thanks for watching. Please like and subscribe. Happy New Year and new decade.